Laura, I am ready to start if you are, so we can roll on time for the lovely guests that have arrived.
Absolutely, let's do it.
Sounds great. Well, I do want to start by welcoming everyone here. Thank you so much for taking the time out to join us. My name is Claudia King. I am the CEO of the ICA, and we want to welcome you to our expert speaker series. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website and on our YouTube following the presentation today. So first, we want to tell you a little bit about the organization that is offering this webinar today. We are the only national nonprofit in the United States, and we're dedicated to providing advocacy, education, and community to those with interstitial cystitis and bladder pain syndrome. We are an organization that's really people and patients doing all the work. So when you send us an email or when you call our organization, you're going to get a response from either myself or Laura Santuri, who is our COO, or from one of our board members. We do have a wonderful group of board members that encompasses patients, patient supporters, people who are relatives to patients, and then we also have a medical advisory council. On that board, we have physicians, we have researchers, we have mental health professionals, and that group of people allows us to discuss with them different types of research and different questions that we have related to the medical side of IC so that we can ensure that we're always giving the best information to our community. So what do we do as an organization? So advocacy. We regularly engage with our elected officials to advocate for awareness and research funding. And we've all heard about government spending recently, but there's a lot of different ways that that happens. So sometimes funding comes through the NIH, the National Institute of Health, the Center for Disease Control, even the Department of Defense. So we actually meet with our congressional representatives to discuss all of those avenues and why it's important to continue funding research for IC. Education is a huge component of what we do. As most of you probably know, we have a website where we house lots and lots of information on everything from food and treatments to providers and just countless blogs and posts on everything that you could possibly think of related to IC. We also have an ICA update, which is our physical and e-magazine, which comes out 3 times per year. We have an ICA e-news, which is our monthly newsletter that comes out at the end of each month. We have our expert speaker series, which is monthly, and that's what you guys are here for today. We're also expanding our educational components, and we're going to save that little teaser for a little bit later in the webinar to share with you our next educational component that we're super excited to provide. And then our community. This is really kind of our most important aspect because this is you. Our community revolves around our social media, our support groups that are housed on social media. It's really about connecting ourselves to our patients and our patients to each other, because we all know that IC-BPS can leave us feeling very isolated and very alone. And so this is the place where everybody can go to know that I'm not alone. There are people just like me. And I didn't say it earlier, but the two of us that are now running the day-to-day operations, we are just like you. So Laura Santuri and I both are IC patients. We have been patients for 20 plus years, I think, at this point, each of us. So we deal with the day-to-day struggles that all of you deal with, which is why we have really decided to shift some things around, look at what we're providing, and see how we can better connect with the community. So we want to give you a couple quick Notes on how to use Google Meet if you're not familiar with it. I know that we have all over the last several years become very familiar with different platforms, usually Zoom. So we're going to just give you a couple quick notes. So if you want to turn on your closed captioning so that you can read what we're saying, then down on your screen, almost right in the middle, you'll see a little box that says CC. And if you click that, that will give you the opportunity to turn on your closed captioning. If you want to share an emoji or a reaction, so if something gets you really fired up during the conversation, then right beside that box to the right, you'll see a little smiley face. So if you click on that, you'll see a host of reactions that you can share during the presentation. If you want to use the chat feature, which we highly encourage, far over on the right side of your screen, you'll see what looks like a little thought bubble or a voice bubble. So if you click on that bubble, you'll be able to open up the chat and you'll be able to type your questions, comments to one another or to the panel. So if you guys want to engage in the chat, feel free to hop in there, say hello to everybody, tell us where you're from, and just send us a quick wave. And if you need to adjust your settings, primarily your speakers or your sound, if you go to that little three dots in between the old school telephone and the hand, then that will open up your settings so you can change your method of where your sound is coming out of with your speakers. You don't have access to your cameras or your microphone for this presentation. So for this, your speakers really are all you would need to worry about.
All right. Thank you very much, Claudia, for the introduction and getting us started. I'm going to jump in here, and the first part of this webinar is pre-recorded. I've been a little bit under the weather, like Claudia, so I wasn't totally sure if I would be able to make it through the entire thing. So the first part, I'm going to play a video where we're going to talk through some things, and then I'm going to jump back in live, and we're going to do some application of some of the things that I talk about in the video. So I'm going to go ahead and get that started. And we'll move forward. All right, we're going to jump right into using research to make informed health decisions. I'm really pleased to be presenting on this topic today. It is one that I care about very much for a variety of reasons, but it's an important topic. We make decisions about our health every single day, and there is an awful lot of information to sift through out there, some of it better than others. One of the things that I'm pleased to see is that I do think we've gotten to a place where, as a society, we do recognize that there are certain sources that are more credible than others. And more I see people going to the published scientific literature for information. And the great thing is we have better access to published research than we have ever had. However, another thing that I am seeing is that studies can be misinterpreted by those who don't necessarily maybe understand research design, or I have even seen people take advantage of other people, which is not a great thing to see. But we know that the decisions that we make have consequences. So this is an important topic. So why should you listen to me about this topic? So in addition to being the Chief Operating Officer of the ICA, I also have a pretty extensive background in health. So my entire educational journey has actually really been focused on patient experience and the self-management of chronic disease. So even for my bachelor's degree, which I actually had a focus on medical anthropology, all the way up through my graduate and my doctoral education. So no, I'm not a clinical doctor, I'm not an MD, but here that's actually not a limiter. A PhD education is actually specifically designed to ensure that the individual who gets that degree has not only a basic understanding of research, but can actually do research. So you do not want me to do a cystoscopy on you. However, I can absolutely talk to you about research. And importantly, I've been there. I've been a patient living with this condition for well over 28 years. And for a good portion of that time, like I said, I've been focused on my own scholarly agenda related to patient education. So I've been in the literature for about a quarter of a century, my own research focusing on self-management for just under that. And one of the things I've enjoyed the most is my teaching and my mentorship of other people in the area of research design. But importantly, I've been a patient for a long time, and I've also been someone who was in such bad shape at one point that I was really, literally willing to take anything or try anything. So I understand sometimes the desperation and the vulnerability that comes with living with this condition. So don't worry, I'm not going to read all these to you because we are going to touch on each of these as we go through the webinar. But in summary, I really want you to walk away from this with an enhanced ability to critically evaluate research in order to make decisions for yourself. So if we're going to do that, we've got to have a basic foundational understanding of research. So I'm going to start with evidence because evidence or data is what is produced through the research process. Often when we say research colloquially, we say, hey, I did some research. And what we mean is we read some things online or we watched some videos on YouTube. But when we're using the technical term of research, we are talking about a process, a very systematic process that produces new information, evidence, or data. Evidence can be, as I said, from scientific studies, or if they're not available, evidence can also come from expert opinion. But as you'll see in this pyramid or triangle, is that evidence that is the most objective, the most controlled, and includes the largest number of subjects is considered to be the strongest. And this does not mean that information on the lower part of the pyramid is wrong or bad, but we do know that it's not as reliable as information that comes from the evidence at the top. And in this webinar, we're going to talk about that middle chunk here because this represents the majority of research studies you're going to come across in the peer-reviewed literature. So let's start with the basics because I think, as I alluded to, not all research studies are created equal. There are different types of studies, and understanding the differences can really help you assess how strong the evidence is. So we're going to start with observational studies. And these, literally just as it sounds, these are studies where the researcher is observing people in their natural environment without any type of intervention. Think of it a little bit like bird watching. You're observing behavior without changing it. And there are some common types of observational studies. One of those, we'll start right at the bottom, are case reports. So these are descriptive studies, usually focused on the medical history of a single patient. They often highlight maybe something unusual or maybe an unexpected observation. And these are useful because they can sometimes raise awareness of rare conditions, or they can be valuable for generating questions or hypotheses that can be tested in future research. But they do not provide strong evidence for generalizing to larger populations. And what I mean by that is making a conclusion and applying it to a large group of people. You cannot do that based on a case report. These are a little bit like anecdotal evidence. They're stories. They're interesting, but they're not conclusive. And a case series is the natural extension of that. They are also descriptive, but we're talking about a small group of patients, so more than one, with similar diagnoses or treatments. And they do provide more information than a single case report, but they do still lack a control group from comparison and are very much prone to bias. So in the way that a case report can be helpful for maybe raising awareness, a case series can be helpful for identifying trends or patterns, but they are far from establishing cause and effect relationships. Okay, so they offer more information there, but they're still pretty low on the hierarchy of studies. So case control is the next level. These studies actually compare people who have a particular outcome, like a disease, and with a similar group of people who don't. And researchers look back in time, so that's the retrospective piece, to see if there are differences in exposures between the two groups, okay? So if you're looking at maybe a group of people who have already been diagnosed with colorectal cancer and a group of people who have not, and then you're looking back in time, maybe it's based on self-report, maybe you're looking at medical history, and you're looking at different exposures to see if those exposures are different. So maybe one of the things you might find is that the group of people who have been diagnosed with colorectal cancer have a stronger history of eating red meat, for example, okay? The important thing about a case control study is that they can suggest associations, but they cannot prove cause and effect, right? So even if you saw that result of people who have colorectal cancer have been eating more red meat, you can't say that that eating red meat causes colorectal cancer. But you can say that there seems to be an association between these two things. Okay, and what I think it's important to note that one study is never going to prove cause and effect. It is about a body of literature and many, many, many studies where we get to that place, and it's not often. One of the rare examples, in fact, is that we know that smoking causes cancer, right? But that's one rare example. So cohort studies are also observational studies, and they are prospective. They follow people over time. So researchers will follow a group of people to see if certain exposures, like things that they're eating or medications that they're taking, are linked to outcomes as those outcomes come about. Okay, so it's very similar to a case control study, except that we're following a group of people prospectively, and we're documenting all sorts of things related to exposures and outcomes, and again, looking for associations, but not ever being able to prove cause and effect. So experimental studies, I'm sure everybody's heard of randomized controlled trials. These studies do involve an intervention, so there is some intervening on behalf of the researchers. And these are generally considered a gold standard, though that does not mean that they do not have limitations. But generally what happens here is that participants are randomly assigned to either receive a treatment that's being studied or a placebo, which is also known as a dummy treatment, right? Or a sugar pill. Sometimes we've heard it referred to when we're investigating a drug. And this randomization helps us minimize bias, and it also allows researchers to determine if the treatment is truly effective. And the comparison in the control group is what makes this study the gold standard, because without it, we really can't assess whether or not any particular intervention is doing what we think it's doing without a group of people who are not undergoing the treatment. And here, so we can identify really strong associations, but again, just to reiterate, cause and effect is not going to come from one study. So, well, what about pilot studies, right? Because we didn't see that on the pyramid. But instead of placing pilot studies on the pyramid itself, it's really more accurate to consider them as a crucial preliminary step that would inform the design of studies that would eventually be placed on the pyramid. So, for example, a really well-conducted pilot study might lead to a randomized controlled trial, which would then be placed near the top of the evidence hierarchy. But pilot studies themselves really aren't necessarily considered to be contributing evidence, except for evidence around the feasibility of maybe an intervention or a program, or the actual methodology, right? So, but there's some limitations of these pilot studies that lead to them not being placed on that evidence period. Again, part of it is the fact that they focus on the feasibility, not the effectiveness of an intervention. It's more about, will people show up? How satisfied will they be with an intervention versus does that intervention actually work? These pilot studies generally have much smaller sample sizes. They're going to have some methodological limitations just because they're a pilot study. And they are absolutely considered a preliminary step, a stepping stone, and not a destination in the research process. So the other thing that we really do need to talk about too is when we talk about, like, we're just unpacking the scientific jargon here, we have to talk about placebo effect. This is super important. So, and we could do an entire webinar just on this, and maybe we should. Our minds are incredibly powerful things. Sometimes just the belief that we are receiving a treatment can have a positive effect or a negative effect, okay? But we're talking about positive effects. We're talking about the placebo effect. In IC patients, placebo effect has been documented to be upwards of 50%. That means that in some studies, upwards of 50% of people in the control group who were not receiving the treatment also saw positive outcomes. And to me, that is amazing. And I don't want anybody to hear this and think, oh, she's finding a way to tell us it's in her head. That is absolutely not the case. What I'm saying is our minds and our nervous systems are amazing, truly. And when we think that we are getting a treatment or we are receiving credible care or that someone cares about us, we get better, which is kind of a cool thing. The problem with placebo effect, though, is it makes it a little bit harder to determine whether or not a treatment is actually effective. So to account for that, we use blinding in studies. And so you will often hear the concept of blinding being talked about in a randomized controlled trial, where you might hear someone say that the study was blinded or double blinded, which means that both the researchers and the participants, neither of them know whether or not they're receiving the actual treatment. Now, there are some interventions that's kind of hard to do, but at a minimum, what we'll have done is that the people who are doing the analysis of the data, they will be blinded to who was in the treatment group and who was in the control group. So it's really important because that blinding helps us minimize the bias from the effect of the placebo effect. Okay, so when you look at a randomized control trial, you want to be looking for language around blinding. The other thing we have to talk about too, when we talk about the basics of research, is sample size and representation. Sample size is important. Think of it like this. If you only taste one grape from a bunch, can you accurately say like what the whole bunch of grapes taste like? Not really, right? Okay, so like one grape out of the bunch isn't going to tell you something about the entire bunch of grapes. So the larger the sample size, the more representative it's likely to be of the overall population that you're trying to apply the results to, and the more reliable your results are going to be. In a similar fashion, representation is also crucial. It is crucial to consider who is included in the study. So a study on the effects of a new medication in men only, for example, might not be applicable to women. So you always want to be asking yourself, does this study population reflect the people to whom the findings are being applied? And even more importantly, does this reflect me? Do I see myself in the study sample or population that I'm reading about in the article? Okay. So those are some of the key terms that we're going to see and things that we can be looking for when we're looking at the research. So we're looking at study design because right off the bat, that study design is going to tell us about some of the potential of the results, okay? And it's going to help us be a little bit more critical. The same thing when it comes to blinding and placebo effect and the idea of sample size and representation, okay? So you don't need a PhD to evaluate research articles. You just need to know some key terms. And by asking the right questions, you can kind of cut through some of the complexity and make sense of the information. But importantly, like I said, not all studies are created equal. Randomized controlled trials are generally going to provide stronger evidence than observational studies, but it doesn't mean any of them are perfect. And like I said, none of them lead to a perfect determination of cause and effect. Okay. And then, of course, size and diversity matter, as I said. Larger, more diverse study samples are generally going to yield more reliable results. And you want to consider whether the study participants are similar to you. So let's talk about some key questions to ask when evaluating research. So if you've got a research article in front of you and you've done the basics, you have like, okay, I know the study design, I've got a sense for who's in the sample, if they used blinding, if it was appropriate. So now there's some questions that you want to ask to kind of be a little detective, right? So some tools that we can use to uncover the applicability and the value of the results of the study, okay? So we've got some key questions that we want to ask. So, and I'm going to guess that none of these are unfamiliar to you, okay? But we're just going to talk about them briefly. So who's telling me this? So we're going to start by examining the source. So is it a peer-reviewed journal known for rigorous standards? And sometimes this takes a little digging. Some journals are a little bit easier to publish in if you're willing to pay, which is unfortunate. Is the information maybe coming from a more reputable organization like the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, or maybe the National Institutes of Health? Is it a blog? Hey, is this on a website that's actually selling a product? Is it a social media post? So you really want to be wary of sources with a vested interest in a particular outcome. The other thing you want to look at is the research question that the researchers addressed. So every study should have a clear research question. What exactly were the researchers trying to find out? If the question isn't clear, the results are going to be muddied too. So you want to look for that. That usually comes at the end of an introduction section. You want to know how they did it, okay? And so you want to look for a clear description of the methods used. And I will tell you, don't get worried about whether you understand all the methods. That fundamentally, what it boils down to is if you read through, you really take your time and you read through a method section in an article, even if you don't necessarily understand all the terminology, or maybe you need to look a word up or two, like, do you have a basic understanding of what they did? Is it clear the steps they took in the research process? So as a researcher, I would ask, could I replicate this study based on what's in this article, based on the information they've told me? If they're not clear or transparent about how they did the study, that's a little bit of a problem. So the other thing is, what did they find? So were the results statistically significant? And they'll usually tell you that. So if it's statistically significant, this means the finding is generally unlikely to be due to chance, okay? Sometimes they'll even talk about effect size, whether it was a large effect size or a small effect size. The other thing to look for is, do they talk about whether the results are clinically meaningful? So just because somebody moves on a, let's say you're asked, what's your pain today? From a scale from 0 to 10, with 10 being the worst. And they find that on average, they move people from a pain rating of a 7 to a 6.5. Okay, well, let's say it's statistically significant. That's fantastic. But what does that mean clinically, like in reality, like for the person who's experiencing the pain? Is it significant to move from a 7 to a 6.5? Okay, so that's another question to ask. Another big one is, who paid for this? And in every article, there should be a section that talks about whether there are any conflicts of interest and funding sources. In a reputable article, those things will be reported generally towards the end, either right after or right before the reference section. And so, look, we're humans. We're not fully objective. It's real hard. It's not possible to be fully objective. But we can get there, or we can get close to it. But if you have a funding source, sometimes, for example, a pharmaceutical company, or maybe another, like an organization that has developed the intervention, it is possible that that funding can influence research outcomes or how research outcomes are reported. Okay, so we want to look at funding sources and potential conflicts of interest. And then you want to ask, does this apply to me? Like, even if a study is well designed and the results are statistically significant, the results are clinically significant, the findings might not apply to you. So do the study participants represent you and your health situation? So are there factors like age or gender, ethnicity, pre-existing conditions that might make the findings less or more relevant to your individual circumstances? And if you can't find that information, if the demographics aren't reported, that could also be maybe a little bit of a red flag. So here, what I'm saying is, be a source detective. Some key things here. Look for research published in reputable peer-reviewed journals or from credible organizations, but be on the lookout for things that tell you that the results or the sources might be biased. And part of that is following the money. Who funded this research? Were there any financial conflicts of interest that could potentially have influenced how the outcomes were reported? And then, do these findings actually apply to you? Okay, consider whether the study participants and their health situations are similar to yours. Findings may not be generalizable to everyone. So one of the final things I want to talk about is spotting red flags. And I kind of got into some of this with the key questions to ask, but there are some just pointed things that should make you skeptical of research findings. These are warning signs that the information might just be not as reliable as we would like. So here are some things that I would always consider. So first of all, right off the bat, everybody should know, beware of clickbait. Okay, media headlines often vastly oversimplify things, or they will exaggerate findings to grab attention. So don't rely just on the headlines, right? Like, we've all seen this stuff, like new miracle cure for cancer. Like, we know that's designed to get people to click on it, but is not designed to be making accurate conclusions off of. Okay. Correlation or association doesn't equal causation. Just because two things are linked does not mean that one causes the other. So, for example, like ice cream sales and drowning rates both increase in the summer. These are associated, but ice cream, I'm quite certain, does not cause drowning. Okay, so be wary of studies that confuse association with causation. Peer review does matter, right? Peer review is a process where other experts in the field evaluate a study before it's published. And this helps ensure that research is of high quality. Be very skeptical of studies that have not been peer reviewed. There is strength in numbers and in diversity and representation. This isn't just a feel-good thing. This is about science. Small sample sizes or unrepresentative samples can lead to misleading results, right? So a study on the effects of a new diet on 10 people, for example, is much less reliable than a study on 1,000 people. We know that one size doesn't fit all, so you need to be cautious of studies that are overgeneralizing their findings, or maybe the authors don't do it, but maybe somebody who is reporting on the study does it, okay? So, for example, the study on the benefits of a particular exercise program for young adults may not apply to older adults or people with certain health conditions. Personal study or stories are not proof. And it kind of hurts me to say this because I'm a qualitative researcher, which means I love to sit down and talk to people about their stories. But anecdotal evidence or personal stories, they absolutely can be compelling. They're not a substitute for scientific evidence. So just because something worked for one person does not mean it will work for everyone. I see this a lot on online support communities where someone says, hey, this particular treatment strategy worked amazing for me. And I think that's an awesome thing to get people thinking about making a decision to try something, but it shouldn't be the only thing they consider. And related, the whole picture, please. So sometimes researchers may selectively present data that supports their conclusions while ignoring data that contradicts them. This is called cherry picking. And one example that I have seen straight up, even in a conference, I saw a researcher get up and present on a randomized controlled trial, but they only reported on the results of the intervention group and not the control group, which to me is a giant red flag, because the whole point of having a control group is to help interpret the results for the intervention group. Great, it worked in the intervention group, but what we know about placebo effect tells us that it's possible that the people in the control group also got better, and that there's no difference, in fact, between the intervention and control group. So that is a perfect example of cherry picking. And finally, I know you've heard this, but if it sounds too good to be true, it's possible that it's not true. So be wary of research or people interpreting research when they make it unrealistic promises or guarantees. Health research is so complex, and there are rarely quick fixes or miracle cures. So here, just to reiterate, correlation or association does not equal causation. Okay, just because two things are linked does not mean that one causes the other. We've got to be super critical of sensationalized headlines, especially in this day and age on social media. You want to read the actual study if you can to get the full picture, and ask questions, right? So all those questions, those key questions that we went through, and even looking for those red flags are going to be really important to help you interpret the results of any given study. All right, so back to live, Laura. Thanks for listening to my pre-recording. All right, so we're going to jump right in. We're not going to do that again. What we're going to do, though, is we're going to take a look at a little case study. I want to do a little application of some of the things that I just talked about in the first part of the webinar. And I have chosen an article that I have seen a ton of conversations about in the online community. Everybody is talking about lactoferrin. So I found the original article of the study that I think a lot of people are talking about, and we're gonna evaluate it a little bit. So first of all, and look, some of this is a little bit over on my head. I'm not a chemist, but I can tell you that lactoferrin is a glycoprotein, so it's a type of molecule, and it is most common in secretory fluids, but it's highly concentrated in colostrum and milk. And here we're talking about bovine or cow lactoferrin specifically. And bovine lactoferrin has apparently been commercialized in Italy for quite some time. And there was a group of researchers who decided to take a look at this to see what impact it might have on people living with IC or BPS. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the article, and we're going to ask some questions about it. We're going to look through kind of who's telling me this, what's the question, and so on, and maybe have a little conclusion, or at least to talk a little bit about what types of conclusions we might be able to make about this particular article. So I'm actually going to switch what I'm presenting. I'm going to show you the article itself, and it might just take a second to pop up here on the screen. Okay, so here's the actual article, and I'll just kind of talk you through how I generally will, when I open up an article for the first time, the things that I'm looking for based on those questions, okay? So obviously the first thing that I'm gonna look at is the abstract. That's usually a good starting point, although I always tell people, like, don't rely solely on the abstract. There's a lot of detail there that you're gonna miss if you are, if that's the only thing that you're looking at, okay? But I will tell you, in this abstract, and you'll see some highlights here, some things that stood out to me right off the bat. So first of all, we're going to acknowledge that this is a pilot study, and it's with 31 women. So it's that's going to tell us something right off the bat when we think about sample size and we think about study design. So we've got a fairly small sample size, if relatively in the research world, and this is a pilot study. So keep in mind that this is not. It's not going to be represented on the level of evidence period, or I keep saying period, pyramid or triangle. And in fact, this type of study is designed to inform a future study that would eventually be represented on that level of evidence pyramid. Okay, so that's right off the bat, that's telling you something. And what I thought was really interesting when I read the abstract, after acknowledging this was a small sample size and a pilot study, their last sentence I thought was pretty bold. They acknowledge, even if our results must be corroborated by randomized double-blinded controlled trials on a larger number of patients, our observations indicate that bovine lactoferrin treatment is efficient in relieving IC-PBS symptoms without side effects. So to me, it feels a little bit like, gosh, there's two contradictory things being said here. There's an acknowledgement that future study is absolutely required, but there's a pretty significant conclusion being made here, okay? So that's the first thing that I noticed. The other thing that I will generally look for right on the start page, or right on the first page of an article is, okay, well, who is this coming from? And I can see that it's a group of researchers from a couple of universities in Italy, which tells me, like, okay, this should be a reputable group of folks who have done this research and who have published this article. The next thing I'm going to look for, and I'm going to try not to scroll too fast. I don't want to make anybody sick, get motion sick. However, one of the first things I look for, of course, is the research question. That's the next thing. Normally, it's right at the end of the introduction section. Here, it's just kind of at the start of their materials and methods. But they acknowledge really clearly the intent of their study. They were interested in evaluating the efficacy of bovine lactoferrin. I think the brand name, starts with V. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that because I'll butcher it. But they're clearly interested in evaluating the efficacy of it. Although I will also say right off the bat, it's kind of interesting because if we think about the intent of a pilot study, which is generally to assess the feasibility of an intervention and inform the methodology of a future, more rigorous study, it's interesting to hear that their intent was to evaluate the effect of a supplement, which is just a little bit of a red flag for me as well. The next thing that I'm going to look for is I'm going to start looking at their methods, because again, like I said, you don't have to understand all of the details here, but you want to be able to read through it and have a general sense of the steps that they took to conduct the study. And the description here is not too bad, and I'm going to spare you a lot of the detail. But I will say that I found the method section to be a little bit confusing because they talk about this being a retrospective pilot study. And it sounds like they were looking back at patient records for about 6 months to see, looking for IC episodes. But then there was a prospective component where for a period, I believe, of 16 weeks or 17 weeks, the participants were taking the supplement and then they were followed for another period of time. And so it's a little confusing based on the categorization of it being a retrospective pilot study. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was how they measured their outcome, which is episodes of IC. And here they're using painful bladder syndrome, PBS. A lot of times we say BPS, they're talking about the same thing. It's interesting because they said that they used a Likert scale from 0 to 9. And while that's a very customary thing to do, like we encounter those types of scales in the healthcare setting all the time, there are actually validated instruments in the scientific world to measure IC severity and symptoms, and they didn't choose to use one. So it is a little bit concerning because I think using this type of Likert scale, I'm not totally sure that they can say that they were measuring what they think they were measuring. And they also never, in this article, talk about how they actually define an IC, PBS, or BPS episode. So in short, I'll spare you all the more boring details, but I will say that as a patient reading this, I definitely had some confusion about how they actually conducted the study. Doesn't mean that they didn't do it right. It just means that they didn't articulate it in the article. So I should be clear about that. The other thing I will say, and I'm going to scroll just a little bit here, is that as we get later, as we, in their discussion section, they're talking about conclusions. The other thing that I know is that they acknowledge explicitly the limitations of their particular study. So they're noting that really a randomized double-blind controlled trial is the most adequate and successful evaluation of a therapeutic intervention. So they are acknowledging the limitations pretty clearly, but still ending the article saying that their capsules are efficient in relieving symptoms without side effects. And so again, you're just kind of seeing this acknowledgement of the limitations, but then still kind of moving forward to say this was effective, which I'm not sure is a fair conclusion to make. The other thing, the good thing is they do, I'm sorry for the scrolling again, but they do talk about the demographics. So there's a table up here where they tell you a little bit about the people who participated in the study. So that's a positive. So if you were looking at this and trying to decide, okay, does this represent people like me? You would have a little bit of information to help you figure that out, okay? So those are some of the basic things that I look for and how I've applied them to this article. A couple other things that I noticed too that would kind of raise at least a flag of caution for me is that they actually explicitly state that there was no ethics approval for this study. Normally especially, well, anywhere, not just the US, when we do research, we need to have an independent body review our research protocol to ensure that we are treating participants ethically. And they actually explicitly said that they didn't need to do that because this was a retrospective study. But again, their methods do describe an active giving of an intervention prospectively and following people over time. And so they did consent people, but they didn't get overall ethics approval, which I thought was kind of interesting. So I will say, as I look at this, that my overall conclusion is that this is a really intriguing pilot. And I know I just kind of nitpicked it. We tend to do that. It does have strengths. I think it's a really intriguing article and study and project, but I do have some questions and concerns about methodology, primarily just because of the lack of detail and some of the discussion that seems to exaggerate results for the type of study that it is, okay? So I'm gonna switch things here real quick again. I'm gonna go back to my presentation. So I'm curious from your perspective. So remember that little smiley face at the bottom of your screen where you can indicate an emoji. Within those emojis, you have a thumbs up and you have a thumbs down. I'm curious your perspective. Give me a thumbs up if you think that a headline or a conclusion based on this article of lactoferrin heals your bladder. Thumbs up if you think, yes, I think that's appropriate, or thumbs down if you think maybe that's not appropriate. Yeah. So, and here's the thing. I feel really bad picking on bovine secretions here, okay? Because I, more than anybody, having lived with this condition for 28 years, would love to see a magic pill come on the market that takes our pain away and our symptoms away. I would love to see that. However, we know that this stuff is incredibly complex, and I'm not saying that lactoferrin may not be that, but what I will say is that based on that article, and even looking at some of the other articles that are kind of even more preliminary than this one, based on kind of how this particular supplement may work, and looking at it in animal models, we're not there yet with the evidence to make that type of conclusion. And so I'm, certainly not going to come out and tell you like you shouldn't take this or you should take this. But I would just say I would exercise extreme skepticism, true skepticism. And I personally would want to see more evidence before taking something like this. So this is just an example of how we can go to the actual research and we can take some time to look for some key things and be able to make a conclusion about it. So, and I'll tell you in a second, because I keep telling you to go to the actual articles. I'm going to actually tell you about how you can do that. But in takeaway, I don't want people to feel intimidated about going to the actual research article, because there are absolutely some really basic things that you can do. Even just looking at the study design, that's going to tell you an awful lot, right? And if I could leave you with anything, it would be this: is just that it's incredibly rare for the results of one study to be strong enough to indicate that you should try a particular treatment strategy, especially if it's anything other than a randomized controlled trial, or even a meta-analysis, which is something for another webinar to talk about. And certainly just be really careful about sensationalization, if that's a word, or overgeneralization of study results, especially if it's coming from someone who has something to gain from it. So how do you get access to these full text articles? So there's a few ways that you can do this. So sometimes you might find something online and it's just the abstract and you don't see the full article anywhere. If you just copy and paste that title and do just a full Google search on it, you will sometimes come to an actual full text version of the article. So that's usually the first thing I do. Google Scholar is a good place to go to see if there's a full text version just kind of floating out there on the internet. The other thing you can do is ask someone who has an affiliation with a university. That's a nice thing to have because usually you have access to all their article databases. But don't forget your local library. I almost became a librarian, actually. I almost went to librarian school because I love the library so much. So I always take any opportunity I can to advocate for the library. If you go to your local library, there's a good chance that there's a librarian there who would be incredibly excited to talk with you about how to find research articles and find full text versions of them. So don't count them out. And importantly, you can just write directly to the author. Every single article is going to have a corresponding author, almost every, right on the first page, and it'll have their email address. People actually are thrilled when you reach out to say, I want to read your research. I have never once been declined when I have reached out to an author to get a copy of a full text article. So don't forget that that is something that you can do. But in all cases, I really do encourage people, especially if you're thinking about making a decision about your own care, get access to the article or articles that you think will be informative for you or that people are citing. So at this point, I am happy to take any questions that folks might have. I'm going to stop share so that way you can just see those of us who are on camera. Feel free, so again, because you don't have access to your microphone, but if you have a question or a comment, please don't hesitate to use the little chat box in the bottom right corner and go ahead and type up a comment or question there. How do you know if an article is peer reviewed? That is a really good question. So usually you're going to see a journal title on that very first page where you see all the authors, their affiliations, the corresponding author's information, and you'll see a journal title. And you can actually just copy paste that, put it into Google, and that will you'll be able to see if it's actually a journal or not. You might find more information that you want to know, but that's generally the starting point, is look for the journal title and just do a quick Google search on it, and you'll be able to know. It's hard, and I will tell you that it is a little bit complicated because there, like I said in the recorded version of the webinar, that there are journals that are peer reviewed but people pay sometimes upwards of like $5,000 to publish in them. And those are maybe a little bit sketchier, but in theory, even with that, there should be always a group of peers who are going to review the article, provide feedback, sometimes really mean feedback. I've been on the receiving end of that when I've submitted my own manuscripts for publication before anything winds up being published and gets in your hands. It's a great question. Any other questions or comments? Who monitors the overexaggeration? Also a very good question. Technically, that should be done by the people who are reviewing an article for publication. But it doesn't always happen. And I think that the article that we just looked at, I'm actually a little bit surprised that those statements were allowed to be included in both the abstract and the discussion section, because they do obviously acknowledge the limitations there, but then they go right into making a statement that is pretty bold for the type of study that it is. So in theory, that absolutely should be the reviewers or the editorial board, because they will also look at an article before it is published. And almost always they're going to put somebody on the review team who has some expertise in the study design. So I don't get asked to review articles for like, really extensive statistical analysis. Most of the work that I do in peer review is qualitative studies because that's where my expertise is. And so I could kind of comment on the methodological stuff. And normally it's not that they've done a poor job with the methodology, it's just that they haven't provided enough detail. That's often the case. But that should be the review team and it should be the editorial board of the journal. Good question. Anything else that folks want to talk about or know? I know this stuff isn't the most exciting stuff, and it takes time to like find an article and read it and go through it. But I really would encourage you, if it is something that you think you're going to do or put in your body, I really do encourage you to take the time to do that. Or if you're not comfortable with your own skill set, print out that article and take it to your doctor. Take it to your doctor, take it to your pharmacist. People sometimes forget about their pharmacist as a really important member of their care team. That person, in theory, if you're getting all your medications from one place, they can look at your medication list and say, hey, like, especially if it's a supplement, like, hey, this may not be, just because it's natural doesn't mean that it's okay to take, especially okay to take with maybe other medications that you're on. So they're a great resource as well. So don't forget about them. Any other questions? Okay, well, you still have time to put them in the chat. I'm just going to kind of wrap things up, and I want to just share with you something that I'm super excited about because I'm kind of a nerd. So obviously, there's lots of different ways that you can engage with the ICA as an organization. Claudia mentioned some of these already, but we obviously have an extensive website that you can visit. We have our digital e-newsletter that comes out at the end of every month. We have the ICA update. You can connect with us in a variety of ways via social media. The new thing that is coming will be a research newsletter. So one of the things that I'm going to start doing on a quarterly basis, and I anticipate the first one going out in March, is to actually take some of the most recent literature that is relevant to our patient community and write up little summaries and essentially try to translate it in a way that makes sense to somebody who doesn't have a PhD in research, so that people who want to stay up to date on the scientific literature on this condition or related conditions, because a lot of us have more than just IC. There's a kind of a one-stop shop where you can get information, again, about the most timely research that's being conducted in a way that is understandable. So this will be going out digitally. We'll post about it on social media as we get a little bit closer to the time that it's ready to go out. But I'm really excited about this piece. I spend a lot of time reading articles anyway, and now I get to talk about it a little bit with other people, or at least share some information. So I'm excited to do that. And I'm just going to check the chat again. If there was any other questions. Claudia, Amber, anything else I should say before we wrap things up?
I just want to say thank you, Laura, for taking the time to present this. It was very informational for me. I hope it was very informational for everybody else here. So thank you for breaking down for us with an actual article what the things are that we should be looking for and how we can start to evaluate these articles on our own.
Always happy to do it. Again, I know it's not the most exciting material, but I think it's important information. So
it's very important, and thank you so much, Flora, for doing this and putting together that beautiful presentation. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Happy to do it, and don't ever hesitate to reach out with questions to the ICA about anything related to this or anything else. Please know that we are here for you if you need anything.
Joy has a hand raised. Joy, if you have a question, do you want to type it in the chat?
And I'm also going to put my email address in the chat too, so that if anybody wants to reach out to me with any questions about anything that I've talked about today, I'm happy to chat via email about any of this. And the recording, a transcript, and I think even a summary, because we have AI doing a little summary for us as we went. All of this will be made available to everyone as well. So enjoy. I think that's a very important point and a very fair point. And like I said, I have definitely been there. I distinctly remember, especially as I was probably closer to when I was first diagnosed, there were moments I distinctly remember actually sitting on the bathroom floor in the middle of the night thinking I would do just about anything for this to stop. And so I want to be clear too, there's no judgment from me or anybody else about jumping on relief or a potential for relief. That is a normal, natural thing to do, especially when you're in a lot of pain. So, hear me say that there's no judgment there. It can be hard. Nobody wants to probably read a research article when you're in a lot of pain. But, I think it's important to take the time. And even if you're not going to go to the research article, even just talking to somebody who you trust and who cares about you before you decide to try a particular treatment strategy can be really helpful too. So no judgment here at all, but just encouraging, just doing some basic things before you make a decision to take something. But that's a very, very important point. And Joy, it's also another good point. A lot of these things are not cheap. So there's a cost associated with any treatment strategy. Sometimes that's time, sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's social, right? So if we're restricting our diet, then maybe we don't want to go out with our friends. So there are costs to all of these things. And that's why I started the presentation with a clear statement of like, these decisions are important. They have incredible consequences for us. So it's even more reason to be incredibly thoughtful about and taking some time before making a decision. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat, but truly don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions. And I look forward to continuing to engage with you and our community in all the ways that the ICA is out there. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.